A single gunshot echoed across the prairie as Penelope Wilson watched her captors fall, one by one, their bodies hitting the dusty ground in a macabre dance of death and deliverance. Her wrists, raw and bleeding from the rough rope that bound her to the back of the wagon, burned with every jolt as her captors' horses slowed to a confused halt. Through tear-blurred vision, she glimpsed a lone figure on horseback emerging from the shadow of a mesa, rifle still raised, his silhouette cutting a stark figure against the burnt orange horizon of the 1875 Arizona Territory. The dust swirled around her as she lay half-conscious on the ground, her wedding dress torn and stained with the red earth of the territory. Just hours earlier, she had been en route to Tuxen to marry a man she had never met, a banker who had corresponded with her for 8 months. Now, as the stranger dismounted his horse with fluid grace, Penelope wondered if she would live to see another sunrise. "Madam," the deep voice came from above her as gentle hands worked at the bindings around her wrists. "You're safe now." When Penelope finally managed to look up, she found herself staring into the most piercing blue eyes she had ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His features were sharp but kind, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming and the dust of the trail. "Who are you?" The man worked silently for a moment, freeing her completely before answering. "Name's Blake Callahan, madam. Was tracking those outlaws for 3 days." He gestured to the bodies nearby. "Didn't expect to find them dragging a lady behind them like some trophy." Penelope tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. Blake caught her effortlessly, his strong arms providing the first sense of security she had felt since the attack on her wagon train. "My escort," she managed, looking back in the direction they had come. "They killed everyone. The driver, the guards, all dead." Blake's face hardened as he scanned the horizon. "How many were traveling with you?" "4 men. They were taking me to Tuxen. I'm to be married." The words sounded hollow now, spoken amid death and dust. "Tuxen's still 40 miles south," Blake said, helping her to his horse. "Night's coming. We need shelter." He glanced at the bodies of her captors. "And these animals will draw predators soon enough." With strength that belied her slender frame, Penelope gripped his arm. "Please, I can't leave yet. My belongings. My mother's locket was in my trunk." Blake studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll check their saddlebags. If they took anything worth keeping, it'll be there." As he searched the outlaw's possessions, Penelope sank to the ground, her mind replaying the horrors of the past hours. The wagon train had been small, just her carriage and 2 supply wagons. The attack came at midday, 6 men appearing from nowhere, guns blazing. Her driver died first, then the guards who had tried to defend her. She remembered being dragged from the overturned wagon, screaming as they tied her to the back of it. "Found this," Blake said, returning to kneel beside her. In his palm lay a silver locket, its chain broken but the piece itself intact. "This what you're looking for?" Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes as she took the precious item. "Yes, thank you." Her fingers trembled as she tried to open it, revealing miniature portraits of her parents inside. "It's all I have left of them." Blake helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, his chest solid and warm against her back. Penelope felt oddly safe despite the circumstance, despite the fact that this man was a complete stranger who had just killed 5 men without hesitation. "There's an old line shack about an hour's ride from here," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "We can shelter there tonight, tend to your wounds." They rode in silence as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Penelope found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, the horror of the day catching up with her body's reserves. Each time she started to slip from the saddle, Blake's arm would tighten around her waist, steadying her. "Stay with me, Miss Wilson," she supplied weakly. "Penelope Wilson, Miss Wilson," he repeated. "Keep talking. Tell me about this man you're traveling to marry." The request seemed to come from far away, but Penelope understood its purpose to keep her awake, alert. "His name is Harold Jennings," she said, wincing as the horse navigated a rocky patch. He's a banker in Tuxen. We've been corresponding since last winter. You've never met him. No. My father died last year, left nothing but debts. Mr. Jennings answered my advertisement in the newspaper. A bitter laugh escaped her. A mail-order bride at 22, not what my mother had envisioned for me. Blake said nothing to this, but his arm remained steady around her waist, a silent support. As promised, within the hour, a small wooden structure appeared on the horizon. It was weathered and looked abandoned, but it offered 4 walls and a roof luxury compared to the open desert. The lined shack was sparse but relatively clean. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot along one wall, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs in the center. Blake helped Penelope to the cot before attending to his horse, returning shortly with his saddlebags. "Let me see those wrists," he said, kneeling beside her and opening his pack to reveal a small medical kit. Penelope extended her arms, wincing at the movement. The skin was rubbed raw, bleeding in several places. Blake worked with surprising gentleness, cleaning the wounds with whiskey from a flask before applying a salve and wrapping them in clean bandages. His fingers were calloused but deft, his touch careful as if handling fine china. "Are you a doctor, Mr. Callahan?" She asked, trying to distract herself from the sting of the alcohol. A half-smile ghosted across his lips. "No, madam, just a man who's seen his share of injuries." He finished with her wrists and examined a cut on her cheek. "War teaches a man how to patch things up, if nothing else." "You fought in the war, Union cavalry." He dampened a cloth and carefully cleaned the dirt from her face. 4 years that felt like 40. As he tended to her, Penelope studied him more carefully. Blake Callahan was perhaps 30, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and a scar that ran along his jaw. His hands were strong, marked with the evidence of hard living, but there was a kindness to his movements that belied his rugged exterior. "Why were you tracking those men?" she asked as he moved away to stoke a small fire in the stove. Blake was quiet for so long that Penelope thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "They raided a settlement 2 counties over. Killed the men, took what they wanted." His back was to her, shoulders rigid. "My brother's family lived there." Penelope's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Mr. Callahan, I'm so sorry." He turned, his face composed once more. "Blake, call me Blake," he gestured to the stove. "I'll heat some coffee and fix something to eat. You should rest." But despite her exhaustion, Penelope couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. Every time she did, she saw the faces of her dead escorts, heard the cruel laughter of her captors. Instead, she watched as Blake moved efficiently around the small space, boiling coffee and preparing a simple meal from his provisions. "You're a bounty hunter?" she asked as he handed her a tin mug of coffee. "Sometimes." He sat on one of the chairs, his long legs stretched out before him. "I take work where I find it, guide, scout, occasional bounty hunting when the law needs help. And right now, you're working for the law." Blake took a long sip of his coffee. "Right now I'm working for myself." His eyes, when they met hers, were hard as flint. "Those men killed my brother, his wife, and their boy. The law moves too slow for my liking." The vengeance in his voice sent a chill through Penelope, reminding her that this man, for all his kindness to her, was dangerous. He had killed 5 men today without hesitation or apparent remorse. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. "Get you to Tuxen," he said, as if it were obvious. "Can't leave you out here alone." "But your vengeance is complete." Blake set down his mug. "Those 5 were all that remained of the gang. It's done." Penelope didn't know what to say to that. Relief and gratitude warred with a strange disappointment that their paths would soon part. "Thank you," she finally said. "I owe you my life." Blake shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Wilson." That night, despite her protests, Blake insisted on sleeping on the floor while Penelope took the cot. She lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night and the steady breathing of the man who had saved her. When sleep finally came, it brought nightmares of being dragged behind the wagon, of hands grabbing at her, of gunshots and blood. She woke with a start, a cry escaping her lips before she could stop it. Immediately, Blake was beside her, a comforting presence in the darkness. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe." Without thinking, Penelope reached for him, her fingers clutching at his shirt as if he might disappear. Blake hesitated for only a moment before sitting on the edge of the cot, allowing her to lean against him as she caught her breath. "I keep seeing it," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes." Blake's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. "I know it fades in time." His voice held the weight of personal experience, not completely but enough that you can sleep again. They sat together in the darkness, two strangers bound by violence and rescue, until Penelope's breathing steadied and she felt strong enough to lie back down. As Blake moved to return to his place on the floor, she caught his hand. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than ever. His fingers squeezed hers briefly before he withdrew. "Try to rest. We have a long ride tomorrow." Morning came with the soft golden light of the desert dawn filtering through the cracks in the shack's walls. Penelope woke to find Blake already up, tending to his horse outside. Her body ached from the previous day's ordeal, but the sharp edge of terror had dulled. When Blake returned, he brought with him a canteen of fresh water and a determined expression. "We should reach Tuxen by nightfall if we push hard," he said, helping her to her feet. "You're Mr. Jennings will be worried." The mention of her fiancé sent an unexpected wave of anxiety through Penelope. In the chaos of the attack and rescue, she had barely thought of the man waiting for her in Tuxen. "Yes, I suppose he will," she said, smoothing down her ruined wedding dress as best she could. "Though I'm hardly presentable for a wedding now." Blake's eyes softened as he took in her disheveled appearance. "I reckon any man worth marrying would be more concerned with your safety than your appearance." Penelope hoped he was right, though she had no way of knowing what kind of man Harold Jennings truly was. Their correspondence had been formal, businesslike. He had offered security and respectability. She had offered domestic companionship and the possibility of children. Love had never entered the equation. They set out as the sun climbed higher, Penelope once again seated in front of Blake on his sturdy horse. The landscape rolled by, breathtaking in its stark, beauty-red rocks and golden plains, dotted with cacti and the occasional stubborn tree. Despite the circumstances, Penelope found herself mesmerized by the wild grandeur of the territory. "It's beautiful," she said during a brief stop to rest the horse. "Harsh, but beautiful." Blake handed her the canteen, watching as she drank. Most worthwhile things in life have an edge of harshness to them. As they continued their journey, Penelope gradually extracted Blake's story. He had come west after the war, unable to settle back into civilian life in his native Pennsylvania. He had worked as a cowhand, a miner, a scout for the army. He spoke little of his family beyond mentioning the brother whose death he had just avenged. In turn, she told him of her life in St. Louis, of her father's gambling debts that had left her destitute, of the difficult decision to offer herself as a mail-order bride. "I had few options," she explained. "I can play the piano and speak passable French, but those aren't skills that feed a person." "And this banker, he seems a good man in his letters." Penelope considered this. "He seems practical, steady. He wrote that he wants a companion and a mother for future children. His first wife died of fever 2 years ago." Blake's expression remained neutral, but she felt a tension in his body behind her. "Practical," he repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. They rode in silence for a while after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Penelope was grateful for the canteen Blake regularly pressed into her hands. By midday, the terrain began to change, becoming more populated with signs of human settlement, fenced land, the occasional distant farmhouse. "We're getting closer," Blake said, his voice close to her ear. "Another few hours," Penelope nodded, suddenly aware of a growing reluctance to reach their destination. The closer they got to Tuxen, the sooner she would have to say goodbye to Blake Callahan and face the unknown future with Harold Jennings. It was late afternoon when they crested a hill and saw Tuxen spread before them, a growing town nestled in the valley below. From this distance, it looked peaceful, civilized, a stark contrast to the violence of the previous day. "There it is," Blake said, bringing the horse to a halt. "Your new home." Penelope felt her heart constrict at the finality in his voice. "Yes," she managed, "I suppose it is." They descended toward the town slowly, as if by mutual agreement neither was in a hurry to end their journey. As they approached the outskirts, Penelope became acutely aware of her appearance, her torn dress, her tangled hair, the bandages visible on her wrists. What would Harold Jennings think of his bride arriving in such a state? The streets of Tuxen were busy even as the day waned, with wagons and riders moving in all directions. People stopped to stare at the odd pair, a rough-looking man and a woman in a tattered wedding dress, sharing a horse. Blake ignored the curious glances, focusing instead on navigating toward the center of town. "The bank would be on the main street," he said. "Do you know where your Mr. Jennings lives?" "His letters mentioned a house on Mesquite Street," Penelope replied, scanning the buildings they passed. "He said it's not far from the bank." They found the Tuxen Territorial Bank easily enough, a solid two-story building with large windows and an imposing facade. Despite the late hour, lights still burned inside, suggesting business continued. Blake dismounted first, then helped Penelope down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. Standing face to face on the boardwalk, Penelope was struck by a sudden, fierce desire to prolong this moment, to delay the inevitable. "I should go in with you," Blake said, his eyes scanning the street. "Explain what happened." Penelope nodded, grateful for the reprieve, however brief. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy door of the bank, Blake a reassuring presence at her back. The interior was cool and quiet, the late day's business winding down. A clerk looked up from his ledger, his eyes widening at the sight of them. "May I help you?" he asked, his gaze lingering on Penelope's disheveled appearance. "I'm looking for Mr. Harold Jennings," she said, striving for dignity despite her state. "I'm Penelope Wilson, his bride." The clerk's expression shifted from surprise to something like pity. "Miss Wilson, we had word your wagon train was attacked. We feared you were dead." "She nearly was," Blake interjected, his voice hard. "Is Jennings here? I'm afraid, Mr. Jennings isn't in the bank today," the clerk said, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps I should direct you to his home." "Please," Penelope said, anxiety building in her chest. What if Harold rejected her on sight? What if he had already assumed her dead and moved on? The clerk gave them directions to a house 3 blocks away, his eyes following them as they left the bank. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows down the dusty street. "I'll walk you there," Blake said, leading his horse. "Make sure you're safely delivered." Penelope wanted to thank him, to say something meaningful about what his rescue had meant to her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, they walked in silence through the streets of Tuxen, the clop of the horses' hooves marking their progress. Harold Jennings' house was larger than Penelope had expected, a handsome 2-story adobe structure with a well-tended garden. A servant answered their knock, her eyes growing round at the sight of Penelope. "I'm Penelope Wilson," she explained. "I'm here to see Mr. Jennings." "Please wait in the parlor," the woman said after a moment's hesitation. "I'll inform the master." The parlor was elegantly furnished with heavy, dark furniture and paintings in gilded frames. Penelope stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly painfully aware of her appearance in such refined surroundings. Blake remained by the door, his hat in his hands, looking as out of place as she felt. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "You've done more than enough." Blake's eyes met hers. "I'll see this through, Miss Wilson. Make sure you're settled proper." Before she could respond, the door opened and a man entered, tall, slender, with carefully combed silver hair and spectacles perched on his nose. He was perhaps 50, dressed impeccably in a dark suit. His eyes widened as he took in Penelope's appearance. "Miss Wilson?" he asked, his voice cultured and controlled. "Is it truly you?" Penelope tried to curtsy, a reflex from her upbringing, but winced as the movement pulled at her injuries. "Mr. Jennings, I apologize for my appearance." "There was an attack on the wagon train, and so I heard," he interrupted, his gaze shifting to Blake. "And who might this be?" "Blake Callahan," Blake answered before Penelope could speak. I found Miss Wilson being dragged behind a wagon by the men who attacked her escort. I dispatched them and brought her safely to Tuxen. Harold Jennings' expression was difficult to read as he processed this information. I see. Well, Mr. Callahan, it seems I owe you a debt of gratitude for saving my fiancé's life. No debt, Blake said, his voice flat. Just seeing to it that she's safe now. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Penelope glanced between the two men, so different in every way, one refined and proper, the other rugged and dangerous. Perhaps, Miss Wilson, you would like to refresh yourself, Harold finally said. Maria can show you to a guest room and find you something more suitable to wear. Relief washed over Penelope at the thought of clean clothes and water. Yes, thank you, that would be most welcome. As the servant led her from the room, Penelope glanced back at Blake, standing tall and unyielding beside the ornate furnishings. His eyes met hers briefly, and she tried to convey her gratitude in that moment of connection before the door closed between them. The guest room was spacious and well-appointed, with a large copper tub that Maria soon filled with steaming water. For the first time since the attack, Penelope was able to truly assess her injuries, the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises blooming across her ribs and back, the small cuts and scrapes that covered her arms and legs. As she sank into the warm water, tears began to fall, the full impact of her ordeal finally hitting her now that she was safe. She cried for the men who had died protecting her, for the terror she had endured, and for the strange emptiness she felt at the thought of never seeing Blake Callahan again. By the time she emerged, cleaned and dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress provided by Maria, the sun had set completely. She made her way downstairs, her damp hair pinned up as neatly as possible, to find Harold waiting alone in the parlor. "Miss Wilson," he said, rising as she entered. "You look much improved." "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Jennings," she replied, taking the seat he indicated across from him, "and for the clothes." "They belonged to my late wife," he said, his expression softening slightly. "She was about your size." Penelope nodded, unsure how to respond. "Mr. Callahan, has he gone?" "Yes," Harold said, a slight edge to his voice. "He declined my offer of payment but accepted a meal from the kitchen before departing. He asked me to convey his farewell to you." Disappointment washed over Penelope, though she tried not to show it. "I see. I had hoped to thank him properly." Harold studied her for a moment, his fingers steepled before him. "Perhaps it's best this way. A man of his nature would not fit well in the life I can offer you, Miss Wilson." The statement, though likely true, stung in a way Penelope hadn't expected. "He saved my life, Mr. Jennings, and I am grateful for that," Harold conceded, "but we must look forward now." He cleared his throat. "I understand you have been through a terrible ordeal. I would not presume to rush you into our marriage under such circumstances. I suggest we postpone the wedding for a few weeks to allow you time to recover and adjust to Tuxen." Relief and an unexpected twinge of disappointment mingled in Penelope's chest. "That is very considerate of you. In the meantime, you may stay here as my guest. I have already sent word to Reverend Phillips's wife, who will act as your chaperone to preserve the proprieties. She will arrive tomorrow morning." Everything was being decided so neatly, so properly. Penelope should have been grateful for Harold's consideration and planning. Instead, she felt strangely hollow. "Thank you," she said, because it was expected. "You are very kind." Harold's smile was satisfied but distant. "We will suit each other well, Miss Wilson, you will see." That night, in the comfortable guest bed, Penelope lay awake, her mind racing. The house was quiet and secure, yet she found herself missing the small lined shack and Blake's steady presence. Harold Jennings was everything his letters had promised: proper, well-established, considerate in his way. He would provide a good life, a respectable life. Why, then, did the thought of marrying him fill her with such dread? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of introductions and preparations. Mrs. Phillips, the Reverend's wife, moved into the guest room beside Penelope's, a kindly but watchful presence. Harold introduced Penelope to Tuxen society as his fiancée, and she was welcomed with curiosity and generally good manners, though she noted the occasional whispers about her dramatic arrival. Harold was unfailingly polite, escorting her to dinner each evening and inquiring after her comfort, but there was a distance between them that never seemed to diminish. He spoke often of his plans for their future, the social standing they would maintain, the children they would raise, the orderly household she would oversee. Not once did he ask what she wanted. As the date set for their wedding approached, Penelope found herself increasingly restless. She took to walking through town each morning, ostensibly to become familiar with her new home, but in reality searching the faces of passing riders and cowboys for one in particular. She never saw Blake Callahan, though she heard whispers of him. A saloon girl mentioned a dangerous-looking man who had passed through, heading north. A shopkeeper recalled selling supplies to a lone rider with cold eyes. Each fragment of information was like a physical pain, a reminder of what she had lost, or rather, what she had never really had. 3 days before the wedding, Penelope sat in the garden behind Harold's house, absently twisting her mother's locket between her fingers. Mrs. Phillips had gone to assist with church preparations, leaving Penelope briefly alone with her thoughts. "Miss Wilson," the voice froze her in place. Slowly, she turned to find Blake Callahan standing at the garden gate, looking much as he had when she last saw him, though perhaps more rested. "Mr. Callahan," she breathed, rising to her feet, "I thought you had left Tuxen." "I did," he said, making no move to enter the garden. "Came back." Penelope took a step toward him, then stopped, acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. "Why?" Blake's eyes never left her face. "Couldn't stop thinking about you, how you were faring, if you were happy." The simple honesty of his words made her throat tight. "I am well," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Mr. Jennings has been very kind," Blake repeated, the same way he had echoed practical during their journey. "Is that enough for you, Penelope?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her heart race. "It has to be," she said, but the words lacked conviction. Blake finally stepped through the gate, closing the distance between them. Up close, she could see the fatigue in his face, the dust of the trail on his clothes. "Does it?" he asked softly. "You were nearly killed, saw men die protecting you, survived being dragged behind a wagon like an animal. After all that, are you really going to settle for kind?" Penelope felt tears well in her eyes. "What choice do I have? I have no family, no money, no prospects. Mr. Jennings offers security, respectability." "And what about love?" Blake's voice was rough with emotion. "What about passion and laughter and feeling truly alive?" "Love is a luxury I cannot afford," Penelope whispered, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Blake stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "What if you could? What if there was another option?" Hope, dangerous and forbidden, flared in her chest. "What are you saying, Blake?" "I'm saying I haven't been able to forget you," he said, his eyes intense. "I'm saying I rode all the way to Santa Fe trying to put you out of my mind, and all I could think about was your courage, your spirit. How you looked at this wild country and saw beauty where most see only hardship." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. "Blake, I'm not a wealthy man," he continued. "I don't have a fine house or a position in society, but I have a small ranch north of here, land of my own. It's not much, but it could be a home, our home." The word "our" hung in the air between them, full of possibility. "You barely know me," Penelope said, though she made no move to step away from him. "I know enough," Blake replied. "I know how brave you are, how strong. I know you deserve more than to be some banker's proper wife." Penelope closed her eyes, torn between responsibility and desire. "The wedding is in 3 days. Everything is arranged. People are expecting, people can be disappointed," Blake said, reaching out to take her hand. His touch was warm, calloused, achingly familiar. "Penelope, look at me." She opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that took her breath away. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "And I think if you're honest with yourself, you might feel something for me too." The words broke something loose inside her, a truth she had been denying since he first rescued her. "I do," she whispered. "God help me, I do." Blake's expression transformed, hope lighting his features. Then come with me, today, now. I can't just leave, Penelope protested, though her resolve was weakening by the second. It would be scandalous, ungrateful after everything Mr. Jennings has done. Would you rather spend your life regretting what might have been? Blake's fingers tightened around hers. I'm not asking for promises, Penelope, just a chance. Come see the ranch. If you decide it's not what you want, I'll bring you back before the wedding, no questions asked. It was madness, absolute madness. And yet, the thought of returning to the house, of continuing with preparations for a marriage based on practicality rather than love, was suddenly unbearable. Mrs. Phillips will be back soon, Penelope said, her mind racing. And Harold will return from the bank for dinner. Blake's eyes never left hers. Is that a yes? Penelope took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a cliff. Yes, she said, and the word felt like freedom. Yes, I'll come with you, but I need to leave a letter. I can't just disappear. Relief and joy transformed Blake's face. I'll wait with the horses at the end of the street. Don't bring much, we can ride faster with less. He squeezed her hand once more before slipping back through the garden gate, leaving Penelope standing in the dappled shade, her heart pounding with the enormity of what she had just agreed to do. Moving as if in a dream, she returned to the house and climbed the stairs to her room. She changed quickly into her simplest dress, one that would be practical for riding, and packed a small bag with only essentials. Her mother's locket she fastened around her neck. At her writing desk, she paused, pen hovering over paper. What could she possibly say to Harold Jennings to explain her actions? In the end, honesty seemed the only course. Dear Mr. Jennings, she wrote, her hand only slightly unsteady. I cannot in good conscience proceed with our marriage. You deserve a wife who can truly love you, not merely be grateful for your kindness. I am going to explore another path, one that my heart tells me I must follow. Please forgive me for any pain this causes you. I will forever be grateful for your generosity. Sincerely, Penelope Wilson. She placed the letter prominently on her pillow, took one last look around the room that had been her temporary haven, and slipped quietly down the back stairs and out into the afternoon sunshine. Blake was waiting as promised, holding the reins of 2 horses, his own sturdy mount and a smaller chestnut mare. His face lit up when he saw her, and the last of Penelope's doubts melted away. Ready? He asked as he helped her mount. Penelope looked back at the town, at the life she was leaving behind, a life of security and propriety, but one without passion or true companionship. Ready, she confirmed, and meant it. They rode north, keeping to less traveled paths to avoid notice. Blake seemed to know the terrain intimately, guiding them through arroyos and across plateaus with confident ease. By nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Tuxen. They made camp in a small canyon, sheltered from view by towering rock formations. Blake built a fire and prepared a simple meal while Penelope spread out their bedrolls. Having second thoughts, he asked as they sat side by side watching the flames dance, Penelope considered the question honestly. No, she said after a moment. I'm nervous about what comes next, but I don't regret leaving. Blake's hand found hers in the growing darkness. We'll take it one day at a time, no expectations. They slept beneath the stars that night, their bedrolls close but separate, a compromise between propriety and the growing desire between them. Penelope fell asleep to the sound of Blake's steady breathing and the distant call of coyotes, feeling more at peace than she had in months. The journey to Blake's ranch took 3 days, 3 days of growing comfort in each other's company. Blake told her more about his life, his childhood in Pennsylvania, the horrors he had witnessed during the war, his decision to come west seeking something he couldn't quite name. Penelope shared stories of her own past, her dreams of adventure that had been buried beneath the practical concerns of survival after her father's death. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a hill to reveal a valley spread below them, green with spring growth. A small creek wound through the landscape, and nestled near its banks stood a modest but well-built cabin, a barn, and several corrals. It's not much, Blake said, a note of uncertainty in his voice for the first time since Penelope had known him. Just 40 acres with grazing rights to more. It's beautiful, Penelope said, and meant it. After the harshness of the desert, the valley seemed like paradise, with its cottonwoods along the creek and the distant mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. As they rode down into the valley, Penelope noticed signs of careful stewardship: the well-maintained fences, the orderly woodpile beside the cabin, the healthy-looking cattle grazing in the distance. "You've built something good here," she said as they dismounted in front of the cabin. Blake's expression was a mixture of pride and nervousness. "Been working on it for 3 years. It's starting to take shape." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable: one large room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, and a curtained-off sleeping area. Everything was scrupulously clean, if somewhat Spartan. "I've been adding to it bit by bit," Blake explained as Penelope explored. "Built on the lean-to kitchen last fall, been thinking about adding another room, maybe 2. Penelope turned to find him watching her anxiously, waiting for her verdict on his home. In that moment, his vulnerability touched her more deeply than any grand gesture could have. "It feels like a home," she said softly. "A real home." Relief washed over his features. "It could be your home too, Penelope, if you wanted." The offer hung between them, weighty with implication. Penelope moved to stand before him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "I'd like that," she said, "but I think we should get to know each other better first." "Take that time you promised." Blake nodded, respect mingling with the desire in his gaze. "As long as you need." In the days that followed, Penelope discovered a new side of herself: practical, capable, unafraid of hard work. She learned to cook over an open hearth, to tend the small garden behind the cabin, to identify the native plants that could be used for medicine or food. Blake taught her to ride properly, to shoot a rifle for protection, to navigate by the stars. They settled into a routine, working side by side during the day and talking late into the evening. Blake slept in the barn, insisting that Penelope take the cabin, a gesture of respect that only increased her growing feelings for him. A month passed, then 2. Summer settled over the valley, bringing long, hot days and the sweet scent of wildflowers. Penelope wrote to Mrs. Phillips, assuring the woman of her safety and happiness, and received a brief reply informing her that Harold Jennings had recovered from his initial anger and had recently begun courting a widow from Prescott. The news lifted a weight from Penelope's shoulders. She shared the letter with Blake as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Seems he's landed on his feet," Blake commented, handing the letter back to her. "Does that ease your mind?" "It does," Penelope admitted. "I never wanted to hurt him. He was a good man, just not." "Not what?" Blake prompted when she hesitated. Penelope turned to look at him, at the face that had become so dear to her over the past months. "Not you," she said simply. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Blake's expression softened as he reached for her hand. "Penelope," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I know I promised you time, and I'll keep that promise as long as you need, but I want you to know that I love you. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you fighting to stay alive, refusing to give up despite everything." Tears blurred Penelope's vision as she squeezed his hand. "I love you too, Blake. I think part of me has since you cut me free from that wagon and looked at me like I was worth saving." Blake raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You saved yourself, I just helped a little." Penelope shook her head, smiling through her tears. "We saved each other." That night, as the stars appeared one by one in the velvet sky, Blake asked Penelope to marry him. Not with flowery words or grand promises, but with the simple truth of his heart that he wanted to build a life with her, to face whatever came together, to love her until his dying day. Penelope said yes without hesitation, knowing with bone-deep certainty that this was where she belonged, with this man who had shown her what love truly meant. They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher, with only a few neighboring ranchers as witnesses. Penelope wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, with wildflowers in her hair and her mother's locket around her neck. Blake wore the cleanest shirt he owned, and a look of wonder as he watched her walk toward him. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with a depth of feeling that moved even the weather-beaten preacher to dab at his eyes. When Blake kissed her, sealing their union before God and their small community, Penelope felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other in ways they had only dreamed of during the long months of waiting. Blake's hands, so capable and strong in daily life, were gentle as they explored her body. Penelope, freed from the constraints of propriety, expressed her love without reservation, giving and taking pleasure with equal abandon. Afterward, lying in each other's arms as moonlight spilled through the cabin window, Penelope traced the scar along Blake's jaw with a tender finger. "I never asked how you got this," she said. Blake caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Cavalry saber at Gettysburg, the same battle that took my father and older brother." Penelope's heart ached at the casual mention of such loss. "You've known so much pain." "And now so much joy," he countered, pulling her closer. "You've given me a future I never thought I'd have, Penelope, a reason to build something lasting." In the years that followed, they did just that. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding as Blake's reputation for fair dealing and hard work spread. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew. First a daughter, Patricia, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, then twin boys, Benjamin and Bryce, who tumbled into the world during a summer thunderstorm. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters, conflicts with rustlers and bureaucrats. But through it all, Blake and Penelope faced each challenge together, their love only deepening with each obstacle overcome. On the 10th anniversary of the day Blake rescued Penelope from her captors, they stood together on the hill overlooking their ranch, now a thriving operation with a proper house, bunkhouse for the hired hands, and expanded corrals. "Did you ever imagine this?" Penelope asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength as they watched their children playing in the yard below. Blake's arm tightened around her waist. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I was just tracking killers that day. Instead, I found the rest of my life." Penelope smiled, thinking of the terrified bride she had been, the mail-order wife en route to a passionless marriage of convenience. How different her life would have been without the attack on her wagon train, without Blake's timely intervention. "It's strange to think that the worst day of my life led to all this happiness," she mused. Blake turned her to face him, his eyes as blue and intense as they had been on that fateful day. "Not strange," he said, "miraculous." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Blake and Penelope Callahan walked hand in hand back to the home they had built together, a haven of love and second chances in the untamed wilderness of the Arizona Territory. Their story, which began with violence and fear, had transformed into one of enduring love, proving that even in the harsh reality of the Wild West, hearts could find their true home in each other's keeping.